Welcome to the Western Region Pastoral Institute. This particular lecture is in the series on the Old Testament and has to do with the topic of the covenant. The lecture will not be an exhaustive explanation of the covenant. It is a very complex idea that is woven throughout the Old Testament, and it fills volumes. But I want to give you kind of a basic overview of the covenant, the covenants, the different ideas that that surround the idea of covenant in not only the Old Testament but in the theological world. So let's start by defining the word covenant. Covenant in the Old Testament is the word berith or berit, and it means covenant. These covenants occur between nations. They also are called treaties, an alliance of friendship. They can even be between individuals. I think in the Bible, one of the covenants that's made in the Old Testament is between Jonathan and David, a sort of a pledge or an agreement. Sometimes it's an obligation between kings and their subjects. It's been referred to as a constitution. Between God and man. Covenants occur between God and man, and that's mostly what we're concerned about in our study of the covenants, is the covenants between God and man. Those covenants are typically accompanied by signs or sacrifices, solemn oaths that seal the relationship, that signify the promises of blessings for keeping the covenant and curses for breaking the covenant. I will put up on the Google Plus page a PDF article from the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament on covenant, if you're interested in reading that. It's a good source for defining words in the Old Testament. So I'll post that on the Google Plus page for the Western Region Pastoral Institute. Covenant oftentimes was made between two parties who were not equals. And then the basis of the treaty or the covenant would be beneficial to one party mostly, and not so much the other. Oftentimes covenants were marked by stones called stela, and the stones would be markers or signs of the contract or the covenant. Later, the stones, which really typified ancient times, but later these would be documents. And we have lots of these documents, these covenants or treaties from the ancient times. Significantly, I just want to point out Genesis chapter 31, 44 to 48, where you see this element of the stone signifying the covenant when Jacob and Laban make a covenant. So it reads like this. Genesis 31, 44 says, "So now come, let us make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me." Then Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. Jacob said to his kinsmen, "Gather stones." So they took stones and made a heap, and they ate there by the heap. Laban called it Jagar Sahadutha, but Jacob called it Galeed. Laban said, "This heap is a witness between you and me this day." Therefore it was named Galeed. So you have the covenant marked by this heap or this pile of stones. Significantly, maybe the most famous covenant is the covenant God makes with Moses, but it is also marked by a testimony of stone. And it is called that, a testimony. The stone tablets that God writes the Ten Commandments on is a sign of the covenant, or the stone of the covenant. Like I mentioned, covenant documents abound from the ancient world. One name you might want to be familiar with, there are lots of studies on covenants, but Meredith Kline did a lot of study on Hittite, what are called Hittite suzerainty treaties, and he claimed that these suzerainty treaties that were typified in the Hittite world became kind of the model for the treaties. And these different Hittite treaties have these different features attached to them, some distinctive elements. So they all start out with a preamble, and in the preamble, the sovereign is identified, the king is identified, and this preamble sometimes gave a brief summary of the covenant itself, but the sovereign was identified. I am the Lord your God, kind of a statement. There was a historical prologue, which gave the basis or the historical basis of the covenant. This was often centered in an act of deliverance or provision on the behalf of the vassal. So the sovereign was the one party, typically the superior party, obviously, and the vassal was the inferior party in these covenants or treaties. So after the preamble and the historical prologue, you would have what's called the covenant stipulations. And this mapped out the requirements of loyalty and mapped out the boundaries of the relationship. It was the rules by which the covenant was to be maintained. Then you would have what's known as a documentary clause. Oftentimes this document or these stones will be kept here. In the case of the Ten Commandments, they were kept in the Ark. And so there's a documentary clause that stipulates that these will be kept in the Ark. In the passage I read earlier with Jacob and Laban, this would be the heap, and it's here in this spot, and we'll keep it here in this spot as the sign of our covenant. The fifth thing was the covenant included blessings and curses. So this was contingent on keeping or breaking the covenant. So these covenants would have this clause in them as well. And finally, there were often witnesses to the covenant. So the witnesses were listed, and these witnesses in the Bible oftentimes would simply be God as the witness. He was the divine witness. Now, this list is not exhaustive. There's lots of discussion on it, but that's kind of a basic overview of the Hittite treaties and the different parts of those treaties. And if you were to compare the treaties or the covenants in the Bible, you would see that they often have many of these elements in them as well. So that's an important thing for you to be aware of with regard to the study of covenants. Now, the other question that's very difficult to unravel is the question of how many covenants were made in the Bible. So we have a lot of different kinds of categories that we talk about with the covenants, and sometimes this is what's confusing, is the multiplicity of categories. So for instance, we have the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, the First Covenant and the Second Covenant, the covenant of works, the covenant of grace in some theological circles. And then oftentimes covenants are identified by the major individuals that were associated with the making of the covenant. So you have a covenant with Adam, you have a covenant with Noah, a covenant with Abraham, a covenant with Moses, a covenant with David, and finally a covenant with Jesus. And so those different categorizations can lend to some of people have about the covenants and how to see and view the covenants. Are these distinct and different covenants? Are they one and the same covenant? And so that becomes part of the challenge of the covenants. But when we look at some of these covenants and some of these major figures that are associated with them, we start with Noah. The Noah covenant you can find in Genesis 6:18, Genesis 8:21 to 22, and 9:1 through 17. This covenant is made with Noah and his seed, or his descendants. That reference would be Genesis 9:9. And really, this covenant with Noah is made on behalf of all creatures on the earth, or every living creature. Um, so the covenant really is promised to Noah even before God's saving action in the ark, and it's established in the aftermath when the waters recede and Noah comes out of the ark. And so the covenant is a pact of accountability for the violence and responsibility for the life of every fellow man. And it answers and restrains Lamech's boast of escalating violence and retribution in Genesis chapter 4, verses 23 to 24. So it's an interesting covenant. It's established by God almost unilaterally. It's marked by a religious sacrifice, and its promise is perpetual. It is an unconditional promise to Noah and his seed that God would not destroy the earth ever again. So that, or the inhabitants of the earth in that way ever again. So that's the covenant with Noah. You have then maybe the next covenant with Abraham being the most significant, although you might have an argument with Moses. But the Abrahamic covenant is given in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, repeated in Genesis 15, repeated in Genesis 17. Similarly, it also refers to all the peoples of the earth as the ultimate beneficiaries. But it contains a specific promise to Abram that he would have many descendants and that he would have land. And it is promised in perpetuity to Abraham's seed, which is reckoned through Isaac and not Ishmael. Now, this covenant has some blessings and curses applied to it as well. Failure to comply with the stipulations will not negate the overall unconditional, everlasting nature of the promise, even though it will cut off individual uncircumcised persons from that promise. So it has an unconditional and a conditional element in it. And obviously for us in the New Testament, this is a key covenant. Galatians specifically gives us detailed descriptions of how this has been fulfilled in Christ, that Christ is ultimately the seed of Abraham through which the world would be blessed. Then you have the covenant made with Moses on Sinai. And this covenant is made not really with Moses himself. Sometimes we call it the Mosaic covenant. That's almost a misnomer because the covenant is made with the children of Israel. You can look at Exodus 19:3, Exodus 19:6, Exodus 20:22 to kind of get the picture of that distinction. So Moses refers to the parties of the covenant as the Lord and you, or the people, in Exodus chapter 24, verse 8. Now, the purpose of this covenant is said by Paul to be given because of transgressions in Galatians 3:19. And there's a lot of conversation as to whether or not this is a continuation of the Abrahamic covenant, because the Abrahamic covenant is repeated Isaac and to Jacob, and here there's also references to that in Exodus chapter 6. God spoke further to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name, Lord, I did not make myself known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they sojourned. So the Exodus story is pitched as a remembrance of remembrance of the covenant. And so there's some question as to whether or not the Mosaic covenant is a repetition of the Abrahamic covenant, an expansion of the Abrahamic covenant itself. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Then you have the Davidic covenant, which is found in 2 Samuel 7. And this has to do with dynastic promises that on the throne of David there would be an everlasting dynasty, a perpetual dynasty. And so you have that continued kind of process. Again, the question being whether or not this was a new covenant, a different covenant than, the one made to Abraham and the one made to Moses, or rather if it's just an expansion and a furthering of it and a reiteration of it to these different key figures in the history of Israel. Then in the prophets, we get the promise of a new covenant. So Jeremiah 31 is typically the passage that we would go to look for this new covenant idea. There's also a passage in Ezekiel. I didn't write the reference down, so I don't have it right here at my fingertips, but in Ezekiel there is a repetition of this promise, this new covenant promise. So it would be Ezekiel 37:26. So these two passages would highlight the promise of a new covenant. And this new covenant typically is associated with the coming of Christ. At communion in Luke chapter 22, Jesus says that this cup is the new covenant in my blood. So we have the establishment and the promise of a new covenant in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and then the establishment of that new covenant in Jesus Christ. So as I mentioned, sometimes the same covenant is repeated to descendants. So in the book of Genesis, the Abrahamic covenant is passed on to Isaac and to Jacob. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that covenant seems to pass on. And many feel that the sum of the Old Testament covenants are really one covenant repeated to the different patriarchs, kings, etc. And that leads us to this major kind of way of looking at the Bible as a whole. And one of those ways is covenant theology. So covenant theology typically is a way of looking at the whole Bible. And that's been one of the challenges for students of the scriptures, theologians, is there a unifying theme that runs through the scriptures? And so covenant theologians are those theologians who see the covenant as that unifying theme of the Bible. In our present climate, theological climate, typically covenant theology is pitted against dispensationalism. So I'd like to kind of end this conversation about covenants with a brief overview of covenant theology and a brief overview of dispensational theology, and then a comparison of them, things that emanate from them that are different. And you'll probably recognize some of these in your own theology, and maybe see where you maybe are back and forth between some of these, because oftentimes people don't differentiate between these theological systems and the differences, and oftentimes people have a mixture of theological systems in their own thinking. They're partially dispensational, partially covenant, and they probably don't know the difference or the distinctives of either system. So let me give a shot at just giving you a brief overview of covenant theology and then dispensational theology. Again, I will put on the Google Plus page some links to what I think are some short, helpful, explanatory articles that will help you understand these differences. Covenant theology typically talks about 3 covenants. One of the covenants is not really mentioned in the Bible per se, but it is reflective of God's purpose to redeem. So it's called the covenant of redemption. And that covenant of redemption is what is God's purpose from the beginning. It is the most fundamental of the covenants. It's God's purposing to save. And that purposing to save occurs even before he creates. So the reference there would be Ephesians chapter 1, where he covenants with himself. This is a inter-Trinitarian kind of idea that the Trinity makes a covenant to redeem. So in eternity past, the Father designs the covenant, the Son agrees to undertake the obligations and the burden of the covenant, and the Spirit agrees to apply the results of redemption. So that would be this underlying foundational covenant. And then typically covenant theologians talk about a covenant of works and a covenant of grace. Now, the covenant of works sets the stage. And oftentimes this covenant of works is associated with Adam. So it's known as the covenant that's made with Adam. The main feature of the covenant with Adam was that God would walk with Adam and Eve. He would be their God in the garden. All they needed to do was obey him. And in obeying him, they would find life. And so the covenant there is a covenant that's based on the obedience of Adam and Eve. So it's then known as the covenant of works. Because of the fall, because they fell, because they violated the command, that didn't just affect them, but it affected all of mankind. And so there was the need for the covenant of grace. And so the covenant of grace is instituted so that man could be saved. And this is a promise of God through Christ to do what Adam failed to do. And so the covenant of grace is instituted, and it is promised based on a future action of Christ's. So the broken covenant of works demanded punishment, and Christ, the punishment that was laid on Christ was required to satisfy the curse that Adam had called down upon himself and upon his descendants. So in the covenant of grace, God unilaterally promises the reward of his eternal and favorable presence, and he pledges by his own person and at his own expense to do so. It's interesting because one of the ideas that you want to kind of see in the covenants is the necessity for the covenant of grace, the new covenant in Christ, to be unilateral. It is not a bilateral covenant. The covenants that we see made with Abraham and with Moses and others are bilateral covenants. They have, as we've talked about, these stipulations that there's still obedience involved, blessings and curses and all of that. The covenant of grace that is fulfilled in Christ is purely unilateral because God fulfills both parts of the covenant. So God is the suzerain and God is the vassal. So you have Christ serving as the vassal role and the Father serving as the suzerain role. And so you have both parts of those covenants fulfilled in the one God. And so lots of theologians have talked about the unilateral nature of the covenant of grace. So covenant theologians would see all of the covenants of the Old Testament, the covenant of Noah, the covenant with Abraham, the covenant with Moses, the covenant with David, as being features or progressions of the covenant of grace. Now, covenant theologians would also talk specifically about the covenant with Moses, the Mosaic covenant, as being the standard for the Old Testament in terms of when we talk about the Old Covenant or the First Covenant, typically they're referring to the Mosaic covenant. And the Mosaic covenant had three parts to it. It had a ceremonial part, that which governed the ceremonies of the nation of Israel, typically the temple sacrifices, the Levitical priesthood, those sorts of things would be the laws that govern the ceremonial. The laws that govern the civil, which would be the laws which govern the nation of Israel, the non-ceremonial but peculiarly Israelite laws that had to do with the land, laws that had to do with giving and tithing, laws that had to do with those sorts of things that governed the nation or the civil part of Israel. And the third part of the Mosaic covenant would have been the moral code, essentially the Ten Commandments. And there's some debate in covenant theology circles. There's an emerging group called New Covenant theologians who believe that the first two parts of that covenant with Moses are abrogated. The covenant of civil and ceremonial law are not binding upon believers, but the moral part is binding on believers. Other covenant theologians believe all three of those things are non-binding, that the law of Christ has superseded the law of Moses, and so we don't need to worry about the Ten Commandments per se. We need to follow the law of Christ. So that's a conversation within covenant theology. Now, dispensationalism is, I wouldn't say it's a response necessarily to covenant theology, but it's also an attempt to give a unifying theme or an overarching theme to the Bible. And so dispensationalism would see, well, maybe it's better to define a dispensation. A dispensation would be an administration or a management of a period of time, a divinely appointed age in history. So there would be different dispensations throughout the course of history. Typically, there are 7 dispensations that are identified. The dispensation of innocence, that would cover the first 3 chapters of the Bible up to the fall. The dispensation of conscience, which would run from the fall to Noah. The dispensation of human government, which would run from Noah to Abraham. The dispensation of promise, that would run from Abraham through Sinai. The dispensation of the law, which would run from Exodus, the giving of the 10 Commandments, all the way through Acts chapter 2 and verse 4, which would be where the dispensationalists see the birth of the church. That would institute the dispensation of grace, which runs from Acts chapter 2 verse 4 to Revelation chapter 20 verse 3. And then the last dispensation would be the dispensation of the millennial kingdom, and that would be described in Revelation 20 verses 4 through 6. These dispensations are not necessarily paths to salvation, but they are ways in which God relates to man. And so it's not so much tying in this historical movement necessarily with the covenants. They play a part in the distinguishing of the dispensations, but it's simply a way of looking at how God has managed the world and has overseen it. Dispensationalists typically have two primary distinctives in their theological system. The first is that they are consistently literal in their approach to the interpretations of the scriptures, especially Bible prophecy. And secondly, they make a distinction between Israel and the church in God's program. So they would see a distinct and eternal difference between the nation of Israel and the church. Part of talking about dispensationalism is that dispensationalism recently is undergoing incredible changes. There's a movement amongst dispensationalists called progressive dispensationalism that is discarding some of the earlier trappings of dispensationalism that they find distasteful and are trying to repackage dispensationalism. And so sometimes it's hard to pigeonhole dispensationalists, but I think those things, the things I just mentioned, the administration eras, the consistently literal interpretation, and a very clear distinction between the church and Israel would be the most common characteristics of that movement. Now, these two groups of people find themselves in vastly different streams when it comes to belief structure. These beginning points and some of these characteristics lead to quite a bit of differences between the two. And I just want to kind of list for you the differences between dispensationalism and covenant theology in very many points. And I think you will see yourself possibly on both sides occasionally of this fence. So let me run through this list. So for instance, for dispensationalists, Israel always means only the literal physical descendants of Jacob. Israel is a very specific term, and it refers to physical Israel. For covenant theologians, Israel could mean either literal physical descendants of Jacob, or it could mean a figurative or spiritual Israel, and it all depends on the context for a covenant theologian. The Israel of God in Galatians 6:16 means physical Israel alone for dispensationalists, but for a covenant theologian, the Israel of God in Galatians 6:16 means the spiritual Israel, and it would be parallel to passages like Galatians 3:29, Romans 2:28 and 29, Romans 9:6, and Philippians 3:3, where they would see a correspondence between spiritual Israel, a spiritual Israel, or the real or the true Israel, or the Israel of God, as being that group of people that is born of Christ. As I mentioned, in dispensationalism, God has two separate peoples with two separate destinies. Israel is the earthly people of God, and the church is the heavenly people of God. In covenant theology, God has always only had one group of people. And that group of people is named many different things. They would be the faithful, the remnant, the church. It just really depends upon the era that's being spoken of, but they are one people. They are not two separate peoples. Dispensationalists believe that the church was born at Pentecost because chapter 2 of Acts begins the age of grace, and the age of grace is characterized as the church age. For covenant theologians, the church began in the Old Testament. So for instance, reference Acts 7:38. And so it begins in the Old Testament, but it reaches its fulfillment in the New Testament. Let's see, there's a lot of these. I'm just going to try and be selective about how much I give you in this. I'll post this this list also on the Google Plus page. Um, in dispensationalism, the church is a parenthesis in God's program for the ages. And in covenant theology, the church is the culmination of God's saving purpose for the ages. The main heir to Abraham's covenant for dispensationalists is Isaac and literal Israel. The main heir to covenant theologians is Christ and spiritual Israel. I mean, there's 30 of these different things that I've got here on this chart. But let me think here if there's anything that's specifically helpful for the covenant idea. I think I'll stop there. The last thing I want to do, and I'll post this as well, I have a lot of things to put up on the Google Plus page, is a chart that speaks of the different ways that the scriptures refer to the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. So as I mentioned, the Old Covenant, the New Covenant, the First Covenant, the Second Covenant. The Old Covenant came by Moses, the New Covenant came by Christ. We have the law of Moses versus the law of Christ, the law of sin in Romans 7 versus the law of righteousness in Romans 9, the law of the flesh versus the law of the spirit, a yoke of bondage, a law of liberty. So there's a lot of ways that the Bible describes the differences between the Old and the New Covenant. So there you have it. Hopefully that was helpful for you to give you kind of a boundary or some definitions with regard to the covenant. All right, have a great day.